Words of Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now in Hebrew, the word Kohelet means someone who has gathered people together. And in this case, it's to learn, so it's often translated in English as teacher. And the teacher is said to be a son or a descendant of King David. And so there are different views about who this figure might have been. Many think that it refers to King Solomon, others to maybe one of the later kings of David's line, and still others think that it's actually a later Israelite teacher who has adopted a Solomon-like persona as a teaching aid. Whichever of these views is correct, the key thing is to recognize that the teacher is a character in the book and is different than the author of the book, who remains anonymous. So we do hear the teacher's voice for most of the book, but it's actually a different voice, the author, who introduces us to the teacher in the first sentence and then at the end concludes the book by summarizing and evaluating everything the teacher just said. So the author is someone who wants us to hear all that the teacher has to say and then help us process it and form our own conclusion. So what does the teacher have to say? Well, the author summarizes the teacher's basic message at the beginning and right at the end. And it's Hevel, Hevel. Everything is utterly Hevel. Now, most English Bibles translate this word Hevel as meaningless, but that doesn't quite capture the heart of the idea. In Hebrew, Hevel literally means vapor or smoke, and the teacher uses this word 38 times in the book as a metaphor to describe how life is, first of all, temporary or fleeting, like a wisp of smoke. But secondly, also how life is an enigma or a paradox. Like smoke, it appears solid, but when you try and grab onto it, there's nothing there. So there's so much beauty or goodness in the world, but just when you're enjoying it, tragedy strikes and it all seems to blow away. Or we all have a strong sense of justice, but all the time bad things happen to good people. So life is constantly, it's unpredictable, it's unstable, or in the teacher's words, like chasing after the wind. Hevel. Now that's kind of a downer. So why is he saying all of this? The author's basic goal is to target all of the ways that we try to build meaning and purpose in our lives apart from God. And he lets the teacher deconstruct these. So the author thinks we spend most of our time investing energy and emotion in things that ultimately have no lasting meaning or significance. And he lets the teacher give us a hard lesson in reality. You can see this most clearly in the opening and closing poems, which focus first of all on time and then on death. So the teacher says, you can spend your whole life working and achieving because you think that makes your life meaningful. You should really stop and consider the march of time. For all of the human effort that takes place in the world, nothing really ever changes. So sure, we develop technology and we build nations that rise and fall, but go climb a mountain and see if it cares. It was there long before any of us, and it will be here long after. I mean, no one's even going to remember you or anything you did 100 years from now, but that mountain, it'll still be there, and the ocean will still be breaking on the beach, and the sun will still rise and set, and so time will eventually erase you and me and everything that we care about. And if that's not disheartening enough, the teacher also can't stop talking about death, all the way through the book, but especially in this poem near the end. He says death is the great equalizer, and it renders meaningless most of our daily activities. It devours the wise and the fool, the rich and the poor, no matter who you are, what you've done, good or bad, we're all going to die, and it's inescapable. So with these two ideas in hand, the teacher goes on to consider all the activities and false hopes that we invest our lives in to find meaning and significance, like wealth or career or social status or pleasure. So you think working hard is going to make life worth it? Think about the stress and the toll that takes on you, all the anxiety and the sleepless nights. And by the time you actually earn some wealth, you're going to be too old to enjoy it anyway. And then by the time that you have to pass it on to someone, they may not even be someone who cares about anything that you did. Or maybe you think pleasure is going to make life worth it for you. Go for it. You know, live for your vacations, live for the weekend party. Monday always comes. Hevel, Hevel. Everything is utterly Hevel. So what does the teacher advocate then? That we become pure hedonists or relativists? Well, no, that would be Hevel too. The teacher acknowledges the ideas from Proverbs, that living by wisdom and the fear of the Lord, that these have real advantages. On the whole, life will probably go better for you. See, but the problem is that even living by wisdom and the fear of the Lord, they're Hevel too, because they don't guarantee a good life. Good people die tragically, and horrible people live long and prosper. There's just too many exceptions. And so even wisdom is Hevel. Again, not meaningless, but an enigma. Wisdom doesn't work the way you think it should all of the time. So what's the way forward in the midst of all this Hevel? And here, paradoxically, the teacher discovers the key to the true enjoyment of life under the sun. It's accepting Hevel. It's acknowledging that everything in your life is totally out of your control. About 6 different times at some of the bleakest moments in his monologue, the teacher talks about the gift of God, which is the enjoyment of simple, good things in life, like friendship or family, a good meal, or a sunny day. You can't control these things. You're certainly not guaranteed them, but that's their beauty. When I come to adopt a posture of total trust in God, it frees me to simply enjoy my life as I actually experience it, not as I think it ought to be. Because even my expectations about what life ought to be are ultimately Hevel. Hevel. Everything under the sun is utterly Hevel. And so the teacher's words come to a close. Right here at the end, the author speaks up again, and he brings it all to a conclusion. He says, the teacher's words are very important for us to hear. He likens them to a shepherd's staff with a goad, a pointy end, which might hurt when it pokes you, but he says the teacher is trying to poke you to get you to move in the right direction, towards greater wisdom. The author then warns us that you can actually take the teacher's words too far, and you could spend your whole life buried in books trying to answer life's existential puzzles. Don't try, he says. You'll never get there. And so instead, the author offers his own conclusion, and it's this: fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of humans, for God will bring every deed into judgment, every hidden thing, whether good or evil. And so the author thinks it's good to let the teacher challenge your false hopes and remind you that time and death make most of life completely out of your control. But what gives life true meaning is the hope of God's judgment. The hope that one day God will clear away all of the Hevel and bring true justice to our world. And it's that hope that should fuel a life of honesty and integrity before God, despite the fact that I remain puzzled by most of life's mysteries. And that's the wisdom of the book of Ecclesiastes.
All right.
The book of Esther, it's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after.
All right, so I think there's a lot of good in that, a lot of helpful stuff in that. So just as we get into this, I said this for some before we started, but if you weren't here for that, we're going to take about 14 weeks to go through it, including tonight, about 14 weeks to go through Ecclesiastes. I don't have an exact syllabus because we're going to go through it as we go through it. It's because I want to make sure we cover all the text. I don't want to put too fine a line on it because I want to make sure that we really get through all this book. We've been doing a lot of overviews in this class, both of the Psalms and Proverbs, but this is one I really want to dig into and make sure we see it through. And so I'm estimating 14 weeks. It may be a little longer. I don't think it'll be shorter. And then we'll get into Job after that. So that's the plan forward for the next few months, most of this year. But before we forget everything we just saw in that video, let's just talk generally as we get together into this idea of studying Ecclesiastes and trying to get into this book. How do you think and or feel about Ecclesiastes? Because if you think about everything you just said, how heavy and much of a downer, it's about death and the relentless march of time. I mean, how many of us really want to spend 14 weeks talking about this? But what do you think about this book? How do you think about it? How do you feel about it? Are you excited to study this book? It's okay it's okay if the answer's kind of like, I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I remember the first time reading it, and I remember thinking, oh no, like everything I'm doing is meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
What in the world am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And you can't really just read one segment and say, well, that's it.
Yeah.
You gotta understand the rest of it. Well, actually fear the Lord and keep His commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And come down to it, but I still balance, well, what's actually meaningless? Am I wasting time here, or is there a way to glorify God to it? You know, this book really has challenged me to question just about everything I do.
Yeah, that's what it does.
It's exhausting.
It is exhausting. That's what he says in the first book. It's a grievous task given to the sons of men. I think your conclusions are right on with what he's talking about. Good. Rachel?
I really like the book of Ecclesiastes, mainly because sometimes I struggle in my walk, so I never get tempted and went backwards or think there's something else outside of Christ for me. It kind of just gives me that reminder that there's nothing there without the book of Jesus. Life is going to be utterly kind of pointless.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great. I love that. Yeah, she said, if you didn't catch it, she said that it helps her on her walk when when there's other things that kind of pull her. This book reminds her there's nothing outside of Jesus that will be worthwhile. Everything else is pointless. I think it's a valuable way to look at this. Cass?
I think this book is often misunderstood
Mm-hmm.
because he does say, eat, drink, and the sentiment, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, oh, great, that's blanket remission.
Yeah.
But in the context of it, that's hopeless.
Yeah.
There's no point to doing that.
Yeah.
So people frequently say, oh, well, the Bible said this in one verse.
Yeah.
Take it and run with it.
There's such a nuance to this that hasn't occurred to me many times in reading and teaching this book. But this time through, I've been really pondering this for a couple months now, trying to get ready to teach this class. And one of the things that occurred to me is there is this great wisdom in enjoying life. The writer of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, Kohelet, however you call him, he really wants you to understand what to do with your life, with the pointless things, the hevel things, the vanity things, the vain things. And he gives you wisdom for it. Enjoy it. There's nothing better than to enjoy a sunny day, or nothing better to enjoy your spouse or enjoy your work. You should enjoy these things. But in the context, you can see what he's saying. It's almost, I don't think it's sarcastic, but it's almost like, but if that's it, then what is it? If that's really it, then what is this really about? So I think that's a great observation because it's both true but not good enough. And I think that's a really complex conclusion that we want the Bible to just be like, hey, this is what I'm saying. That's not how Kohelet preaches, not how he teaches. He pushes us to really be introspective. I think Jesus teaches like this too, by the way, where we see this short saying, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then he's like, did you really get it? And you're like, oh, maybe I need to think about this again. That's how he teaches. And so if we get too comfortable with oh yeah, just enjoy it, you're like, well, you have to think, is that really what he's saying? I think that's great insight. Kathy?
I think it ultimately challenges us to try and keep the perspective rather than saying it's this way or it's that way, it's not that way.
Yeah, some people call the preachers, how some versions translate it. I like the idea he's almost a critic. And what he's doing in being a critic is really poking holes in anything we get overly confident in our life under the sun. If you're really confident, he even pokes holes in religious attitudes. Not that it's wrong to be religious, but he's like, you got to be real careful. In chapter 5, he'll say, watch your steps as you enter the temple of God. You're like, whoa, what are you saying? I'm going to worship God. He's like, no, you better be careful. Don't be overly confident about that. And so I think you're right that there is this constant message of really being thoughtful about how you live. And for me, I know this is true for me, and maybe you relate to this, but it's really easy to kind of put blinders on or to be willfully ignorant or say, yeah, this is good enough, and so I'm going to ride with this, and to not think about the consequences or what it really means. And he doesn't let us do that. Really, you have to be thoughtful. What is your life about? What are you doing with it? Dad?
Yeah, you can really see a lot of negative and downer in the book, but to me also, it can be freeing. It can lift the burden off me because it's similar in my mind to when I was a teenager and I was very stressed and worried about my future, how I was going to succeed, how I was going to make it, what precise path I need to do. I need to go to spiraling things going on in your head trying to figure out what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And, I went to service and I got baptized. And it was at that point when I got baptized that I realized, wait, I don't have to worry about all that. I don't have to become a doctor or a rocket scientist. I don't have to do any great thing. It's not on me.
Mm-hmm.
I just need to live my life every day and, put food on the table, so to speak. So that was freeing,
Yeah.
being baptized and realizing, okay, the perspective is on God. And that's kind of what this book does.
Yeah.
It just says, take it easy. You live for me. I've got this. You don't have to figure everything out. Everything doesn't ride on you.
Yeah. No, that's really well put. Yeah. It is a freeing thing. And I think that's what we don't understand is there's pain to get to that conclusion. You have to go through some pain. You have to let go of some things. You have to let go of, your accomplishments or your achievements or your intellect, your wisdom, your knowledge, your whatever, your reputation, your popularity. And not meaning that you can't have those things. And letting go of them, you can still have those things. But letting go of, this is who I am, this is why I exist, or this is what makes my existence matter or purposeful or have meaning. And letting go of those things, it's very freeing. But some of us hold so tightly to those things that we can't. And this book will challenge you, say, if you really want to hold on to this, what's it worth to you? And what's the good in it? What's going to happen when you die? Or what's going to happen as time goes on? Or what if, time and chance occur to us all? We're all just birds caught in a snare or fish in a net, it says. So, yeah, those are good points. But we have to look it hard in the eye to come to that conclusion, through Ecclesiastes at least, the way it'll teach us. More to say here, I'm sure, but let's move on. I want to look at the kind of the book ending of his conclusion, right? Ecclesiastes 1:1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And then at the end, his last words that the author records for us, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Some, in the video we watched covered this. Some translations translate this vanity. I think that's one of the better translations. Many translations translate it meaningless. Does someone else have a different word here in their Bibles if you're looking? Any other words? Vanity, meaningless. It can also be emptiness. There's a lot to it. But if you're paying attention to the video, this word in the Hebrew is actually the word havel. What does it mean? You can just restate some of the stuff we saw in the video, but you can also, as you look at this, you can even ask, what does it mean? It all is vanity. Did you remember anything from the video that said, what's the literal kind of picture of it? Vapor, breath, wind, yeah. It's funny, it's not the same word for Holy Spirit, that kind of breath and wind, but it is specifically talking about the shortness of breath. I should have put this up here, but Psalm 39 uses this same word. Psalm 39, you can see it in verse 5 and verse 11. Psalm 39 and verse 5 says, behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime as nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere havel, a mere breath. Psalm 39:5 says. And then at the end, end of another section, Psalm 39:11 says, with reproofs you chasten a man for iniquity. You consume as a moth what is precious to him. Surely every man is a mere breath or havel. So there is an idea in this where it is short, like a vapor, something that's like smoke. What did you say, Ricky?
Well, I was thinking of James.
Yes. Yeah, he says the same thing, right? James says, what are you but a mere vapor? Why are you so arrogant, right? So there's a humbling or a humiliating to some sense. But there's also, I like what they said. He said in the video, he says it's an enigma. It's not just that it's talking about kind of the difficult to grasp and difficult to kind of see through and everything's kind of short and transitory. I think the better word for it is actually absurd. I think what the preacher is saying, the book of Ecclesiastes, is everything is absurd. Someone has all this money and all this wealth, and then he has no kid to pass it on to. Or another guy has no heir, and he keeps working. Why does he keep working? What is he working for? He's just going to die? That's absurd. And some people, the race isn't always to the strong, nor the battle to the swift. The race isn't to the swift, or the battle to the strong. Sometimes the slowpoke wins the race. That's absurd. And you think about this, I've been thinking about this for a few months, and just things have happened, in our life. We have a baby. What joy, what a great thing, and how much meaning and purpose and beauty. And then we have friends who had a stillborn at 37 weeks. That's absurd. It's just absurd. Like there's nothing for it. There's no meaning to it. There's no good in it. There is just, if you're looking at life under the sun, I know I'm a preacher, so it's hard to speak where it's like I'm excluding God from this. But in life lived, that's absurd that happens. And to try and grasp it, to try and understand it, say, no, there's meaning in this. To try and tell it to someone who's experiencing the raw end of that deal and say, no, there's meaning in this. That's absurd. There's nothing. And so what the preacher, Kohelet, whatever you say, what the teacher is saying to us is everything is vain or vanity, or I like to say the word absurd. It's just a vapor. It's a smoke. You can't grab onto it. You can't see it. There's a mystery baked into existence. And this is where all philosophy and everything we argue about. This book is kind of an argumentative book in a sense. It's meant to be that way. But it challenges us to really see the world this way. Again, which to your point, Kathy, you can't be too confident. If everything is this way, and I'm so confident about how I've got it all figured out, you better be careful. Pat?
I think what bothers us about this a bit is the lack of control.
Mm-hmm.
There are things we can't control.
Yes.
And that's what he's saying. With God, in life, you can let go of that control.
Yes. Yeah, that's the aspect of control, I think, is striking at the heart of this. Because we're going to see in a second, I'm answering a question I'm going to ask in a second, so if you remember it, you'll have the answer. But he's really striking at a secular worldview. And this is why he embodies these perspectives and uses them in the first person. So the preacher will say, I was king in Jerusalem, and I had all the riches and all the wealth. And he's doing that to show you, like, when I had this, it was all meaningless. And I think part of the reason he writes this way is so we can buy in and so we can understand he's telling this. Or he'll say there's other perspectives. Who knows? He'll say in this book, who knows what happens after we die? And then we'll say, well, fear God and keep his commandments. He takes care of us. But he says, no, who knows? But in the process of preaching this way and having this perspective, it's all about, it's making this point that at the secular worldview, it's talking on the same level of it so that people in that worldview can understand that they're out of control. Right? That there is no control. That even if you think you have control, what does it lead to? And it takes that perspective on to kind of be on the same page as that person and logically step us through where that leads. And if you try to control everything, good luck. Maybe you do a great job. For what? Les, and then Ricky.
I think he's saying, though, lack of control or things are meaningless and so forth. But if you have a God-centered life, that's very worthwhile. Yeah. He does say that.
Yeah, that's the conclusion, right? And that's what's so interesting about this is that it's important to hold on to that this is, like we read at the very end, or we'll read in a second. The conclusion the author puts on this book is this is the whole of man, to fear God and keep his commandments. But in chapters 1 through 11, we're not going to see that directly. We're going to see everything else, all the worthless, hevel, smoky stuff, and how worthwhile it is, and really thinking through and poking holes in it and questioning it. And if we forget, we can start to lose track of what he's saying, or the final point he's making. But you're right that the entire point of this book is leading us to that, but it's leading us to that by questioning all these other things that might feel meaningful or purposeful, and really showing us it's not. And sometimes I think if we read this book too close and forget the big picture, we can lose sight of where he's going with it. And we say, what does he mean by that? In chapter, like for example, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 19, he says, for the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast ascends downward to the earth? Well, if you know the whole point of the book, you might say, dude, like you know the answer. But that's not the point he's making. And so I make this fine point. You're right, Les, and it's good to know that. But also we have to keep track of this. He's going to say things that are going to challenge us. Because as much as we know that, there's a level in which nobody knows that. And that's kind of the murky, enigmatic, smoky area this book challenges us in to think through. Anyway, I've talked a lot. Ricky, what were you going to say?
Well, along with that, even though you're in Christ, you got it, there are going to be situations challenge you to the very core. Even with God, you know, I'm telling you, there's things that some haven't experienced.
Yeah.
I can guarantee you.
Yes.
It's the attitude in which if you come off like you got it figured out, you're done. Even in Christ.
Yeah.
But you better watch your attitude as you go through this thing. Not only towards your family, but towards your fellow man.
Yeah.
And if you got an attitude of I'm here, believe me, you're gonna be here pretty quick.
Yeah.
At some point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because God is the ultimate. And like he told Job, hey, was you there when the hairs on your head?
Yeah.
Was you there
When I separated the seas or made the mountains, yeah.
If you have an attitude, I got it, and you're gonna get knocked to your knees, and I can guarantee it's gonna happen.
Yeah, and that's that point he uses to make even a greater point, that it's all absurd.
Yeah.
Right? Even wisdom. At one point he says, don't be overly righteous. What? That's a verse in the Bible. Don't be overly righteous. What are we doing then? Like, what's this all about? But he's making this point about this pursuit and how you even if you give your whole life to it, you may not see the benefit of it. And I'm not again, this is life under the sun. We may zoom out after Christ and knowing the whole conclusion of the book, say, okay, well, I'm going to fear God. I'm going to strive to be right by Him. But what he's saying is, even if you live life, and this is what Job's friends got wrong, right? Even if I live life perfectly by wisdom and perfectly right, I still might find hard times. And in fact, you will likely. And again, this is the conclusion of the book. That's absurd. And in a sense, we should all be morally outraged by that. That should, if we don't have some amount of question with God about that, then I don't think we're really thinking about that question enough. I'm sure a lot of you have thought through it and come to good conclusions. So I'm not saying you're in a bad place. What I'm saying is we need to think through this. Because God tells us to live this way, and sometimes living that way, a lot of times actually, leads to bad results on earth. And that's a hard thing that we need to work through and wrestle through. Go ahead. I need to move on after this. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about the Apostle Paul talking about taking heed lest you fall.
Yes. Yes. He who thinks he stands, take heed lest he falls. I think he's quoting Proverbs, isn't he? I think it's in Proverbs as well. Maybe I'm mistaken on that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Keep a grain of salt on that one. So what does Kohelet's conclusion mean? This is very similar. We don't have to talk about this one a lot because in talking about the word hevel or vanity or absurdity, we kind of answer this question. But when the word of the preacher, this Kohelet says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, could you rephrase that? Like, what is he saying? To Adam's question or point at the very beginning, is he saying, give up? Is he saying, who cares? And to Cass's point, maybe it all just is hedonistic pleasure. Might as well have fun while I'm here. Is that what he's saying? How would you, if you were going to share this idea with a coworker or someone you met and say, hey, have you ever thought about life? Here's what this guy said about it. Would you just say it's all vain? How would you say that? How could we rephrase this idea? Go ahead, Pat.
You have to read on to verse 3.
Yeah.
Explains verse 2.
Yeah.
You can't stop at verse 2.
Yeah, what advantage does a man have in all his work, which he does under the sun?
Under the sun.
Yes.
Vanity, all under the sun.
Yes.
Not the whole. Our life is just not even a blip
Mm-hmm.
on eternity.
Yes. Yeah. That's good. Yeah, so there is this idea where it's all, in the context he's talking about, under the sun, life under the sun. Yeah, that's good. Anything else? Any other ways might rephrase this? Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's so many things that are, right? There's so many things that are a waste of time. And that's the point we're trying to get at. And we've talked about this a lot. But that word futility is helpful to see here. So again, I'm asking the same question like 3 different ways. What's Ecclesiastes about? Well, here's a quote, and if you don't remember any of this, that's totally fine. But I want to highlight one thing about it. Kohelet writes from concealed premises, and his book is in reality a major work of apologetic or eristic theology. Well, all that means is he's writing in a way to make an argument, to debate you. And this is your point again, Kathy. He wants to push you. This book is written to push you out of your preconceived notions and your current conclusions. That's the whole point of this book. So that's why he writes from these concealed premises. He doesn't always tell you where he's going with it. That's what that means. Its apparent worldliness is dictated by its aim. Koheleth is addressing the general public whose view is bounded by the horizons of this world. Koheleth writes from concealed premises and is... I'm copied and pasted this wrong. That's why it's so long. The horizons where he meets them in their own ground and proceeds to convict them of its inherent vanity. And in his book is, in fact, a critique of secularism and of secularized religion. Put a pin in this idea. But this is one of the things I think we need to remember and keep in our hearts and in our minds as we read this book and study it. That it's all about it's an apologetic book. Not like he's sorry about it, but that's a word for just argumentation. It's a word for he's making an argument in this book. And he's making an argument right squarely at the heart of people who are just caught up in this world. Which doesn't just mean atheist or agnostic people in our terms. It also means Christians who just live for now. Christians who just kind of think, this is life, and God's just about kind of giving me a good life, kind of giving me good guidance, teach me how to be moral. There's a lot of that today. Sometimes Christianity gets boiled down to just moralism. Well, Jesus was a really good teacher, and he taught you how to live life, and that's kind of what it's about, right? I'm just happy to be a Christian because Jesus teaches me how to be good, which he does, and that's great. But if your religion is bounded by those horizons, like he says, and you're just looking at it like, well, I just got to be a good person, and that's what it's about, you're wrong. Ecclesiastes will challenge you just as much as it'll challenge the agnostic or atheistic thinker of our day. And so that's why all of us need to come into this, not just kind of hopefully learning so we can talk to people in the world who have these perspectives, but we also got to, again, we got to make sure we're introspectively questioning our conclusions. Am I really viewing God the way I ought to? Am I really viewing this life and this world the way I ought to? Or have I sometimes we use Jesus and God and the gospel as a salve for our consciences and for our perspectives, and now I feel good just because I know I'm following the right guy. And it helps my life here on earth be better, which it does. But if that's the main thing, then we're missing it. Which is why he says, fear God and keep his commandments, right? That's why the conclusion is greater than that. But this is this secular critique of secularism, and it's important he says secularized religion is something we need to hear and pay attention to, because we need to ask ourselves constantly, am I really living like this life is it? Because a lot of Christians are. And that's a challenge for each of us, all right? Let's move on. I want to show you some of the key words and phrases. You can probably guess the first one. Havel is used 38 times in this book in various forms. Sometimes it'll be translated vanity or meaninglessness. Sometimes it'll be translated breath or vapor or smoke. Another important phrase is under the sun. Pat, you pointed this out. Why is this phrase so important in the book? Why is the phrase under the sun so important to see and understand in this book?
Talking about life on earth.
Yeah, it's talking about life on earth. It's talking about life as we all see it and experience it. That's really important to see because that also helps us avoid some possible wrong conclusions or misunderstandings. He's not really talking, when he says, who knows if the beast goes to heaven or not, who knows? He's just saying, we can't really know. We can write movies like All Dogs Go to Heaven because there's like a fun, like, oh, maybe it's true, who knows? And that's the world he's living in. Nobody knows. But we know with faith through Christ what's true. The resurrection, Christ answers this. 1 Corinthians 15 answers this. But he's not preaching from that perspective. He's teaching and arguing from a perspective that anybody can interact with. Gene?
Well, I think that's really nails what Cass said, and it means that it's not your unique experience.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way the whole system is. This is what everybody's encountering. It's not just you.
Yes. That's such a great point, too, that he's talking about, this is reality. He's talking about reality. He is talking about experiences, but he's using those experiences to show that this is reality. And maybe you're living a great life. But that doesn't make sense of this world to the thousands of people that aren't. I mean, sometimes, I understand where this comes from, but sometimes we pray things, and I think that we don't understand, like, when we pray, we'll pray about, like, war-torn countries, and we should pray for those people. We should pray that God would care for them and comfort them, that they would be right, but sometimes we can be careful, we can kind of get in this place where we're like, well, we're so glad we're not. And we should thank God for the peace and security we find, but sometimes we have to be careful that we're not just constructing this place where it's like, well, God, thank you that you've made my life really comfortable. I'm not saying that's wrong either. I'm trying to thread a needle here where it's saying our experiences don't paint the reality of this world. And what Ecclesiastes is showing us that even if you live a good life or you happen to be rich and you happen to have a good heir who's wise, who will use your money and make it even better, good for you. But most people don't. And are you okay with that? Maybe many of us will be like, yeah, I'm okay with that. And that's okay. You can enjoy these things. But what he's saying is life under the sun is absurd. And some people get it, some people don't. Some people have good lives, some people don't. Some people die real young when they shouldn't. Some people live old and then they really shouldn't. Right? And he's saying this is absurd. But so many of us, to your point, Gene, I think we like to use and this is like the definition of postmodernism, my experience and my truth is all that matters. That's pretty self-centered. And maybe you're not postmodern, maybe that's just a self-centered, arrogant worldview, but this is the fact that this is showing us the reality in this life you can't be all sunshine and roses, or else you're not seeing it. And it's also not all doom and gloom either, which is important to see all that. I need to move on because we don't have a whole lot of time, I'm sorry. Another important phrase you're going to see in this a lot, maybe not as much as the other ones, but chasing after wind. It's just such a perfect picture of what he's saying. Of course, wisdom is a key word. I like that Ecclesiastes is not just going to teach us wisdom, but it's also going to show us that we can't overly rely on wisdom, which, for the future class, that'll also be one of the points of the book of Job, by the way. God is a central figure in this. I think it's an important one to not miss, labor and toils. What is existence post-curse, Genesis 3, but labor and toil? Women have their labor. Men have their labor. The curses show that both of them are going to be painful and aggravating, and no one wants to go through it, but it's just we all have to. Life is full of labor and toils. And one of the other big words is evil. These things are evil. This is evil. That's evil. And then no. Who knows this? How can you know that? Does anybody know this? These are going to be key words and phrases we'll see throughout this book, and it's important to see he uses these words to leverage kind of what we know. What we think is evil. What do you think about your work? What do you think about God? Really, all these key words, these last 5 especially, he's not going to define them for us, but rather he's going to question our relationship with them. What is your relationship with wisdom? If you remember, Proverbs is all about, hey, wisdom will give you a good life. That's kind of the very hunky-dory, loving message of Proverbs. Wisdom's going to be really good for you. And then Ecclesiastes is literally going to say, is wisdom really that good for you? Everyone dies. So why even be wise? I'd rather be a fool, right? And the very next thing he'll say is, well, but wisdom actually is pretty good. It's like, well, what are you saying to me? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? What's my relationship with wisdom? What's my relationship to God? One of the questions he'll ask is, can we really know if God's good? Like, under the sun, right? Without Jesus Christ, without Romans 5 and the beauty of the gospel, if you were just understanding, okay, yeah, there is a God, if there's someone who created all of this, who can undo me by his word, why is my life so painful still? Why are some born stillborn? And why are some miscarried? Why is there all this pain and suffering? There's a great question there under the sun. Why do I have to work so hard for nothing? Why do I have to go back to work on Monday? What's the deal there? What is evil, really? What do I know? These are questions he's not going to answer, but he's going to push you to think, well, do I know the answer? So these are the key words and phrases to pay attention to. And then I just want to look at the last few words of Ecclesiastes because it's important to read these verses. Because to your point, Les, this is where the book's going. This is the conclusion. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 9. In addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. And he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. The words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They're given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. I think rather it means because this is the whole of man. This is everything to man. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Perfect. This is a perfect conclusion. And it's really helpful to keep this in mind. And I think, so again, if you paid attention to the video at the beginning, there's the preacher, but there's also Ecclesiastes 1:1 and Ecclesiastes 7 as well, there's a verse. And then at the end here, you see there's an author who's writing the preacher's words. Why do you think he says this about the preacher in verses 9 and 10? After a book full of the preacher saying all sorts of things like, hey, just eat, drink, and be merry. What's the point? Does anybody know? Is life really good? Is there a God? After this whole book, why do you think the author might say verses 9 and 10? Do you think he's reminding us that we need to think about these things carefully? That's what I think the purpose of these two verses of. He's like, hey, don't forget, you're not dealing with some doofus here. Like the book of Ecclesiastes isn't just some guy who's wrong. What these two verses are trying to remind us of is if we think we can kind of just like deftly maneuver and say, okay, yeah, I got this thing. I got him dialed in. I know, he's just, he's wrong, or I don't disagree with this. He's like, no, you have to really, really consider this preacher is he's a heavyweight to deal with. And then he says this, the words of the wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. What do you think about these two verses? And then he says, but also be warned. What do we do with these verses?
There's no good to studying without action.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's no good to studying if there's no action, right? They're supposed to goad us. What else? I think he's both, in verses 9 and 10, telling us to really, in verses 9 and 10, he's telling us to really, really think about these things and to weigh them. But I think in verses 11 and 12, he's saying, like to Cass's point, it needs to lead to action, but also be warned that you can give your whole life to figuring all these things out, and it's an endless pit. If you start getting onto YouTube or into philosophy books, good luck. I have a little bit, and sometimes it just pulls me down the rabbit hole, and I don't think I'm any better for it. Sometimes I'm definitely worse off for it. You have to, it's just, there's so much to it. So the conclusion, when everything has been heard, it's funny, it's a 12-chapter short little book, and the author's like, you've heard everything. Now, when everything's been heard, what do? Fear God. This is such an important message, which, by the way, I'm going to preach on this. This is me like the seed root of the verse of a thought for the sermon Sunday morning. What does it mean to fear God? It's not just do it. It's not just be good. But it's a relationship kind of understanding. Pat?
I'm teaching this to younger students. Rather than fear God, we use the word fear.
Yeah.
But the true Greek is translated.
Yeah.
Hebrew. This is Hebrew.
Yeah, this is Hebrew.
The Hebrew is translated revere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so it's this idea of reverence, or that he is above me. And that's Ecclesiastes teaches a lot of that through the sections, even in life under the sun. And keep his commandments, because this is the whole of every person. And this last verse is important, for God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether good or evil. This verse is begging for Jesus Christ, by the way. Because if you read this verse and you're not like terrified, then you don't understand your actions. You don't understand the weight of sin in your life. But the gospel hope, and the invitation for tonight, is that Jesus Christ gives us hope beyond really hope in this judgment, that we have a perfect atonement, a perfect propitiation for our sins. All the evil we've done, it finds its forgiveness and its atonement in Jesus Christ. Because without him, the end of this book is a scary book. Even if it does give us good direction, which it does. Anyway, I'm preaching, which is my job. But anyway, so that's everything. This is the intro. Next week, we'll get into chapter 1. Read chapter 1 and 2. Read the whole book if you can. It's next week. But especially focus on chapters 1 and 2. We'll get into those this next week. I really appreciate you all. I love you all. I'm excited to study this book together.